the newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
And it's Lewis.
And if you hear a bit of background noise, a bit of ambient sound, it's because we're in a railway terminus. Well, not exactly a railway terminus. It was a railway terminus, but it is now the centre for where the Conservative Party conference has just got underway.
Don't mention railways here, John.
I bet they are wishing
Don't
it was
talk about
not a
railways
railway
here.
terminus right now.
The Transport Secretary made a whole speech about the future of transport policy in the UK and never mentioned those three words, HS2.
Funny that.
He did, funnily enough, talk about the amount of track that we had built in this country under 13 years of Conservative rule, which was 1,200 miles. And the the Chinese, according to Boris Johnson, have built 25,000. I mean, that's the former leader of their party saying how much better the Chinese are at building railways.
But forget what's going on in the conference hall. Mateless, you have been to the Fringe event which has drawn bigger crowds than anything else today.
I've been walking round the Midland Hotel trying to find the end of the queue into the Liz Truss speech. And it goes right the way through the lobby, right along the ground floor of the Midland Hotel, a big old Victorian hotel. And it goes right the way up the stairs and right way down the other stairs. And it is full of people, admittedly a lot of journalists who might be there for the shock factor. But there's a lot of people who want to see what Liz Truss had to say. And once we got into the room, and to be honest, there was a moment where we thought we might not be allowed into the room, and we definitely got a Liz Truss side eye.
Well, to be clear, we had been told, because I had contacted them a few days ago, because they sent out a message to the media saying, do you want to come? And I said, we'd like to come. Yeah. And I got a message back saying, oh, Lewis, I'm afraid there's just not room for you all, I'm afraid. But I'm sure some of your LBC colleagues will be able to fill you in.
Sure enough, we did.
Yeah. But they didn't count on the mateless factor, of course.
But it's just worth underlining that a year ago, we were told when Liz Truss made her leader's speech, and she had a pop at people who live in North London townhouses.
Oh, he's never got over this, has he?
Make podcasts. She was talking about the newsagents.
Yeah, there was definitely a frisson when she caught sight of us, but it was fine. We stayed, and the room was absolutely full of people who still believe in the Liz Truss vision for Britain. They want low tax, they want more growth, they want a person of vision. And it was honestly like the last 12 months had never happened. It was like she was this aspiring, visionary leader who was coming to the front of the party with her ideas. And you're kind of sitting there going, wait a second, you do remember, sort of amnesia aside, you do remember what happened 12 months ago when she not only had her platform but had the entire premiership with which to make her case. You do actually remember that moment, don't you?
I've just been speaking to a Tory grandee in the House of Lords now, but has held a number of very senior positions and is in the engine room of the Conservative Party. And he is frankly horrified. He's tearing his hair out at the support that she's still getting. And he says, look, we have become the party of Brexiteers, of UKIPers, and frankly, if I had my way, we would be appointing a Tory party leader now. We would not be electing one, because by electing one, we are getting people like Liz Truss, which is what the Conservative faithful wanted a year ago, and look what a road crash that turned out to be.
But Rishi Sunak was appointed, and that was the point that many of her, sort of infantrymen made in the room. Oh, Liz Truss, don't forget, was elected by the grassroots of the Conservative Party. Rishi wasn't.
But look, this is This is a conference story of two parties, right? You've got the headline act, or what is technically the headline act, in the auditorium, which, by the way, they've moved to the smaller auditorium here at the Manchester Conference Arena rather than the big one, which tells its own tale. Largely empty for even, reasonably senior cabinet ministers. But then it's pretty buzzing on the fringes with people like Truss, with people like Rees-Mogg, with people like Patel, which is where the energy is for this conference. But it speaks to, in a way, just to take Liz Truss, though, she is someone who, she likes to think of herself as a, political teacher, right? She likes to think of herself as someone who is taking the argument to people. She even said in that speech, right, we need to make these conservative arguments again. It's all predicated on the idea that Conservatives have not been sufficiently bold in making their arguments. But, of course, the truth is, as she says herself, the people she really likes talking to are other Conservatives. She's less of a teacher, more of a preacher. And I think, really what you've got to think of is that this is a conference which is really, half of it is setting itself up, not looking at the past, not looking at the present, but is looking at the future. It's looking for what the post-Sunak period looks like and setting themselves up for the period of opposition that most of them feel like is coming. And you know what? It really reminds me of, it doesn't really remind me of a conference that I've been to, but one that I've seen enough footage of. It reminds me of the Labour 1980 conference, right?
Wow, that's even before my time.
Yeah, because for this reason, right, the Labour 1980 conference is the first proper conference they have in opposition. Obviously, it's not quite like in that sense. But then you have Tony Benn getting up to the conference stand in that conference and listing out a whole ream of things that the last Labour government at that time did or didn't do, saying it wasn't socialist enough. And you can just see that all of these characters, they are looking at 13 years of what they think of as basically failure. They're trying to find a way of analysing and coming up with an answer for why it has been a failure. And their answer is, we just weren't ourselves. We just weren't conservative enough. It's actually a way of thinking that historically has been more characteristic of the left in British politics. And you are seeing that hard ideology at play at this conference.
But you made the comparison with the Labour Party conference at 1980. I wasn't at it, but I do remember it. The point was then that this was the post-mortem that took place after losing power in 1979.
Totally.
We are a year away from the general election, and you already feel that the battle lines are being drawn. And I was just talking to a Cabinet Minister Special Advisor about the reshuffle and who are the people that you can and can't get rid of and the reasons for it and not for it, and the extent to which you've already got Cabinet Ministers who are lining up, positioning themselves, whether it be Kemi Badenoch or whether it be Suella Braverman, who are looking to be the leader after next. And you've got polling advice, apparently, from central office, where they've been focus grouping anyone who stands still for more than 10 seconds, that's saying that Rishi Sunak is more popular than the Conservative Party. He's ahead of the brand of the party, and therefore the way you've got to win the next election or have any chance of saving the next election is you've got to go all in behind Rishi. And obviously, as we can see from this conference, a lot of people are struggling with that.
Yeah, they're not doing that. Liz Truss's former Environment Secretary was on the stage after she spoke, and he talked about the number of MPs now supporting their group, the Conservative Growth Wing, let's call it. And he said it's about 60 now. We knew there were about 30 MPs that were rebelling against the Chancellor's sort of tax rising agenda. If they have 60, that magic number is very close to Rishi Sunak's majority right now, which means any kind of legislation involving taxes could cause him a huge headache. And I think the problem for Rishi Sunak, and it's not something that we've talked about that much, is he cuts quite a lonely figure. I don't know who his tribe is. I don't know who his friends in the cabinet are. He loved Dominic Raab. Dominic Raab obviously left over those bullying allegations. He's got Claire Coutinho, who's been brought in now as sort of, energy because she is a proper Rishiite. But if you look across the range now, who really supports him? It's not Suella, it's not really Jeremy Hunt. I mean, Jeremy Hunt's a sort of a steadying chancellor. But if you're trying to work out, like David Cameron had his Cameroons, Liz Truss might have her fruitcakes, but they are her fruitcakes. And you look at Rishi Sunak and you say, you're quite isolated. I don't know who your friends are.
Yeah, and one of the things talking about the energy at this conference being from the Trussites and those sorts of people and this weird unreality that we're in, that we could be a year on from everything that happened and it's Truss who is exuding the energy. One of the reasons for that is I was told at the weekend someone said that the Tory whips had been phoning round MPs trying to offer them inducements to get up to Manchester because so many of them had just sort of
free
said
tickets for Manchester United, free tickets for Man City.
And would rather just take the week off or do something in their constituencies. Particularly all of those, by the way, of course, they've got a lot of MPs who aren't standing again. There's no reason or inducement for them to come up here
and there
for
are no
one
trains
last
to
conference.
get back.
And there are no bloody trains to get here or get away in the first place. But I mean, just on that Club for Growth, Gang for Growth, sort of growth. What is it? Make Britain grow again.
Yeah.
Hang on, Mugbah.
Mabuga.
The Mugbahs.
It really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, really good one.
I'm going to keep saying Mabuga.
They just need the caps.
I'm going to get a Mabuga cap.
Something else
for all of you.
Oh, I can't wait. Something else which adds the air of unreality about it is fine. It goes back to that whole trust thing. Everyone agrees we need to grow more. Fine, everyone does. But to listen to them sort of roll off all of the things that are making British businesses struggle. Truss says we need to become the party of business again. Environmental regulation, taxes, the blob, strikes, industrial action, whatever it is, there is, of course, an elephant in the room that, funnily enough, they don't mention. What's that? It's Brexit. That is something you talk to any exporter, you talk to any small business, you talk to some of the exhibitors in this very hall when they are struggling in terms of getting exports and imports in and out of the country, something that is completely absent from the so-called MGBs or Club for Growth lot.
Can I just quote you, Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Oh, please do.
Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg. We should get rid of all the remaining tariffs with France and cut regulations.
Wasn't there a time when we didn't have tariffs?
How could we do? If only there was this amazing magic bullet which would have taken all those
European
tariffs away.
economic area.
Yeah.
He also said, I want cheaper food, I want hormone-injected beef from Australia. I've eaten beef in Australia. It's delicious. There's nothing wrong with it. Don't think you sound a bit weird, do you, Jacob?
The thing you were saying, though, Emily, a moment ago about who are Rishi's core supporters. I was just talking to a Treasury person, senior, who says that at the moment everything is concentrated in Downing Street. All power, all decision-making, people are being shut out of all sorts of decision-making. Now, as parliaments go on and a government gets embedded and a prime minister sees he's fighting an election, that always tends to happen a bit. But it underlines the point you were making, the sense that Rishi Sunak is sort of by himself with a few trusted people in Downing Street, and it's him and them against the rest of Whitehall, the rest of the government departments. And if you've got the Treasury being shut out of decision-making, that really is quite significant. And, Jeremy Hunt is the steadying influence, and I'm sure he's heard when he needs to be heard. But it sounds like an awful lot of the big decisions are being taken for political reasons with all the levers and all the voting inside number 10.
When you hear the Chancellor say things like this vicious circle of tax rises, and you kind of think, well, are you saying that we should be cutting taxes or that they have to grow? Or what are you actually saying it? Because it sounds as if you, the Chancellor, are at one remove for any of the decisions that are actually being made. But I just want to get back to what happened in the room for a second, because I do think there is this air of unreality that we still have to discuss surrounding Liz Truss, and that's that everything sounds very positive, when you're sitting there. And this is often what happens, you're in the room and you kind of start nodding along, right? And she talks about growth. As you said, nobody stands up going, what do we need? Less growth.
When we want it now.
Now.
Never.
We want less growth, and we always want less growth. So she talks about, for example, house building. And she talks about the need for young people to have houses. And she could have been literally on this show talking exactly the same way that we have for the past sort of 6 months about the need to have more housing. And then she says, I want 500,000 more houses, new houses built every year. And then she says we need to give tax incentives to council to cut regulation. And so you go, OK, that's the thing. That's the moment. So what are you saying? That they have to build wherever they want? We get rid of... I mean, it sounds very positive until you realise that she's probably talking about environmental legislation again, water polluting, all the things that Labour wouldn't vote to give up in order to build houses. And she's saying Labour's the one holding us back.
Emily, that's because these are people who, from the very beginning, are unwilling to deal in trade-offs.
Or in
They're
reality,
unwilling
quite
to
frankly.
yeah, very often. They are people who, their fundamental analysis of politics is always that. Goes back to what I was saying before, that we're not being sufficiently conservative or we're not exerting a strong enough will. It was the same philosophy that we saw again and again during the Brexit negotiations. When confronted with a hard reality, you have a choice, or you have two types of politician. It's basically the two halves of the Conservative Party. One half go, OK, let's see what we can do. We might not get everything that we want, but we might get some of it. And you have the other half who are absolutists. And it was the absolutists that you were within that room.
Look, if you look at where this comes from and where this normally happens in political parties, it's normally on the Labour Party. The ideological purity of the left, no compromises with the forces of capitalism. You don't want to be making compromises that you let down the working class. And that always gets a big audience. Now you're getting Liz Truss getting a big audience for that sort of message. But the significant thing I think about this is that how is this going to be played out on the television bulletins tonight and in the newspapers tomorrow? It's going to be Liz Truss at the centre of events at the Conservative Party conference. If you're Rishi Sunak, that is the last thing in the whole world that you want. You want Liz Truss nowhere near this conference. You want this to be anything that is a reminder of the chaos of last year. leave aside the people who are in the room and cheering and whooping and hollering, I think a not large chunk of the rest of Britain will think, oh my God, she's still there.
But there is a tradition at Conservative Party conference, and I've been at enough of them to remember Boris Johnson completely hijacking Theresa May at her own party conference just before her speech, and he had, the media mob absolutely hanging on every word he said. He also, funny enough, it was Boris Johnson again, who tried to do it in the Cameron years when he was, the pretender to the throne, as it were. There is something about Conservatives and leadership. They are brutal to each other, and she is acting like she's about to topple him because he toppled her.
Yeah, but the difference, of course, is that when Johnson was doing that, he was still after her job, Theresa May's job. Truss has had the job, albeit for a microsecond. The weird thing about this is having a former Prime Minister doing it.
Exactly.
And not only doing it, but also acting in a way which is adding to what I would say is the radicalisation of the Conservative Party in all sorts of ways. Look, what did we see at the weekend? Her and her team partly helping orchestrate a pledge among Conservative MPs never to raise taxes again, never, under any circumstances. That is what happened to the Republican Party in the 1990s and 2000s. That it becomes a sort of
Boston.
It becomes a sort of shibboleth, a kind of article of faith that under no circumstances could you ever raise taxes. That is crazy for any party of government, a true aspiring party of government, to commit to. You imagine what the Labour equivalent would be. It's like we'll never cut taxes under any circumstances. We'll only ever increase state spending under any circumstances. It's a sign of a party which is descending into zealotry and replacing any idea of pragmatism that they might have had to ideology.
So we've talked about all that's been happening in the room where Emily Maitlis eventually found Liz Truss and got to the front of the queue. I suppose it's worth talking a bit about what's actually happening in the conference itself.
What with the actual government?
With the actual government, with Secretary of State after Secretary of State making speeches to audiences that were a little on the thin, some might even say, anorexic side, because there were huge rows of empty seats when Mark Harper, the Defence Secretary, spoke, and there were others as well where you just thought, there really isn't an audience for this.
There should have been, quite frankly, because some of the stuff that was coming out of Mark Harper's mouth
wasn't boring.
Was jaw-dropping. This is the Transport Secretary who didn't mention HS2 at all.
Shh, don't mention
Sorry.
it.
No.
Take that way.
Those are three letters not allowed.
I mean, he spent a lot of time talking about buses and bus routes, and I know that buses are important to people, but it also is your actual annual party conference. And the trouble with talking about buses is that you remind people you're not talking about trains. And the trouble then with talking about roads and buses is that you remind people you're not talking about trains. And you're not talking about massive infrastructure projects. You are starting to go down the line of conspiracy theories. And Mark Harper turned his wrath on the 15-minute city, this idea of trying to make cities more pedestrian friendly. And he had just said, and he said in his speech, Tories will stop the misuse of 15-minute cities. What is sinister is the idea of local councils deciding how often you can go to the shops. I agree, Mark. I think
that would be
is
sinister.
It's really sinister. I don't think it's true. In fact, I'm pretty confident it isn't true. If you are a local council that is trying to stop people going to the shops, please write in and tell us at the newsagents.
And Harper wasn't alone. I mean, Claire Coutinho, the Energy Secretary, who, insofar as there are kind of Sunakites, she is definitely one of them, favoured by the Prime Minister. She wasn't speaking in a kind of sort of measured, pragmatic way. She was speaking in a way which was fevered. I mean, she was talking about the idea that basically anyone who didn't agree with government energy policy are zealots. She was talking about the idea that Keir Starmer doesn't want anyone to eat meat, even because he's a vegetarian. And, it started to sound like you've basically had a lot of people here, Tory ministers, who spent too much time on the internet. They start to kind of talk in those ways, in tropes and memes, of people who are basically sort of online too much. And I think one of the problems with the whole Conservative strategy at the moment, look, what Coutinho was trying to do, what Harper were trying to do, they're trying to create dividing lines. That's what this whole conference is about. It's trying to create political dividing lines with Labour. And, they've got to do that because they're still, 15, 20 points behind in the polls and nothing seems to be shifting. And they've identified energy and they've identified net zero as one of those, and environmentalism as one of those dividing lines. It's a big bet, though, and therefore probably a big weakness. of their overall strategy, because in all sorts of areas they're basically trying to create issues to rail against which either don't exist or which people have very little conception of. So 15-minute cities is a really good example of that, right? You say 15-minute city to the average person, they either haven't heard of it or the chances are they think, what? So everything is within 15 minutes of where I live. Sounds like actually quite a good idea. If they had more time, it's possible they might be able to politicise net zero and the politics of the environment more, as it has in other countries. But they're starting from quite a low base because it hasn't been a big political issue up to now, and they're trying to do it in double, quadruple time before the election.
Of course you're trying to create dividing lines. That's what you're there to do as a political party, to say this is us and this is them. But if the them that you are portraying is so absurd and so based on falsehood, then it just becomes ridiculous.
You sound stupid, right? You sound odd.
So, for example, we heard from Mark Harper that every lamppost in Labour areas is going to have a camera on it. What, every lamppost? Literally every lamppost will be having a camera so that it can give you a parking fine? I mean, it was just nuts. The other thing that is driving me mad at the moment, I've got to get this off my chest, and forgive me, the way that they are talking about the scourge of potholes reminds me of conferences going back 35, 40 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet threat. I'm sorry, potholes are a pain in the backside. But, we are talking about potholes as if, my God, the future of Western civilization will hinge on whether we can deal with that.
I think potholes are really important to a lot of people. Genuinely, like if you drive, potholes really wreck your car. Having said that, as I said before, this is the annual conference for the whole party. If you're talking in potholes, it does suggest the narrowness of your vision, that you haven't got anything else to trail. You can't talk about big infrastructure policies. You can't talk about the amazing vision you've got for the 21st century. You can't talk about joining up the North with your railway scheme, which might now be imploding as we speak. You can't even talk about your vision for growth in the country. And so potholes are very narrowly focused on going down into the ground. It's the road equivalent of a tummy button.
But also the other thing about the potholes, and God bless potholes, I agree with you. When I used to ride when I used to ride a scooter, when I still ride a bicycle, potholes were really kind of horrifying and dangerous and all the rest of it. So yeah, they're in place. But it is the way that it's being framed that you can either do rail infrastructure or we can do potholes, as if you cannot do both, as if there is somehow, we can't walk and chew gum. So therefore we're going to do potholes rather than HS2.
At one point, Mark Harper actually warned about, and again, this is the idea that things are just sounding fevered and the danger is they end up sounding just absurd. He warned about political speed limits. Political speed limits, i.e. citing what's happened in Wales. It's like woke trains. And we should just talk about HS2, right? Because it just continues to haunt this conference.
In this hall?
In this hall that used to be a railway station.
As if you were about to catch a train.
And we are still... A couple of journalists, Robert Peston and Sam Coates, Sky News, they're saying that their understanding is that the scheme is going to be axed, although we just listened to Jeremy Hunt finish his speech just now. No sign of it. As we said, Mark Harper didn't mention it. And I think that's the point about the potholes point, right? Is HS2 is the biggest piece of infrastructure we have done in this country for a century. And for it not to get a mention, and for people in the country, including investors, by the way, still making investment decisions potentially on the basis of a massive piece of infrastructure which might or might not happen, the incongruence of that and talking endlessly about potholes and political speed limits is very jarring.
I have just spoken to a Treasury source who says to me, look, it's expensive. The cost has overrun. But so too has virtually every major infrastructure project that has ever been built. Look at Crossrail, now the Elizabeth line, everyone says, how fantastic. M25, when it was being built, people were saying, what's this all about? It's the biggest car park in the United Kingdom. It's now an essential piece of infrastructure. What about the M4, which people protested about? And this Treasury source was saying, major infrastructure projects create growth, they create jobs, and they improve the kind of, the way the economy works. And so the idea that the Treasury as a whole have given up on HS2, I think is false. I think there's a live argument still going on.
I think what it speaks to, though, is a lack of confidence. I mean, a government that knows what it wants to do goes ahead with a plan because it believes in the plan. This all speaks to a lack of vision. But I also want to talk about the stuff that we're hearing, because when you talk about things that aren't true, it feels like a brand new world of policies that were never going to happen being cancelled, or where we're being saved from sinister practices that don't actually exist. And it is this world where you end up having to invent things that your opposition are doing, invent things that your predecessors were doing, invent things that are potential acts of any future government, because you can't actually talk about your own manifesto anymore. You haven't got one.
But Emily, what's one of the quintessential examples of that Jeremy Hunt just spoke about in his speech minutes before we were recording this? Debanking.
Yes.
You know, Jeremy Hunt, Chancellor of the Exchequer, just got up and said that we are going to change rules so that nobody can be debanked because they're not politically correct enough. Now, the Financial Conduct Authority have said that there is no evidence that politicians are being debanked.
They talk about the Nigel Farage Coots case in particular, and said there was no evidence.
Indeed so, and Hunt is one of the more measured members of the cabinet.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I think if you sitting in the main hall, never mind the fringes, which have their own extremities in different ways, sitting in the main hall, if you just close your eyes and you listen to some of the things that are being said, HS2, on Brexit, trans rights, ECHR, taxation, debanking, you name it. Honestly, I went to enough of them. You could have been at a UKIP or Brexit Party conference. The way in which, in policy terms, and in the way that the Conservative Party talks about politics, the move to the Farage agenda, and guess what? He's here, by the way, and he was at the rally.
He was in Liz Truss's room,
has been extraordinary and has been the big story of the long 13 years of Conservative government.
Well, I think what we're at the moment is, do you remember on Crime Watch at the end, where Nick Ross would say, don't have nightmares? What the Tories want you to do is to have nightmares. Oh my God, Labour will have, do this, they will do that, they will debank you, they will this, there was everything else under the sun of all these things that could possibly happen. And I just wonder how credible any of this is. Well, a short time ago, I spoke to Andrew Mitchell, Secretary of State for International Development, part of the Cabinet, former Chief Whip, about the mood in the Tory conference hall. Andrew Mitchell, welcome to the newsagents again. It's a bit dull in here, isn't it? A bit flat.
No, it reminds me very much of the conferences in the early 90s, 1991, where, of course, we just elected a new leader. There was a change in tempo. The Prime Minister was taking possession of the party, focused on the next general election, which, of course, against the odds, he won. And I can see...
So it doesn't remind you of 96 then?
No, not at all. It reminds me of 91. And I think that the speech that the Prime Minister makes, which is obviously a very important one at this conference, will set out why, in these foothills of the general election, he is the right man to lead us through these turbulent times.
Tax cuts? Michael Gove wants them.
We are a low-tax party. Everyone in the Conservative Party, wherever they stand...
But he was calling for a cut in taxes.
Would like to see lower taxes. But I trust Jeremy Hunt, who, after all, has shown himself to be a steely and effective finance minister, to make the judgment about when is the right time for this. But no one should be in any doubt that the Tory party is the low-tax party.
So are you saying butt out Michael Gove?
No, not at all. I think Michael was expressing an opinion, but I heard what Michael said, and he said that he backed the judgment of Jeremy Hunt, and I agree with him. Jeremy Hunt's judgment is the right judgment to back on this.
Do you think the party is behind him? And we were here last year, and it was a bloodbath what unfolded at what unfolded at the Conservative Party conference. Do you need to make apologies for what happened during the Liz Truss era to the British people?
We need to get on with the business of serving the British people and delivering on their priorities. And I do remember last year's conference, and what strikes me is the contrast between then and now. The economy has been gripped in very difficult times, and that the combination of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt is delivering on the priorities of our constituents.
Do you need to apologise for what went on? Because it was a shambolic episode in British politics, I would say without parallel.
I don't really dwell in the past like that. I'm focused on the future, on delivering for my own constituents and making sure that our government and the party deliver for the country.
When you say delivering for the future, and which of course is the slogan of the conference about the long-term future, and you're very on message, you're putting a thumbs up to that idea. All very good. Isn't this actually all about focusing on the next general election? You're thinking about the next 12 months, what you need to put in place. It's not the next 10 years. HS2 is going to be abandoned, it looks like. That's not long-term planning. I mean, there are all sorts of things, and net zero, all sorts of policies which are to give you a bit of a lift over the next few months before an election.
Well, we are focused on the future, and the election is part of that future, but we're focused on tackling the problems, and the net zero is a very good example of that. The Prime Minister, rightly, having drilled into all the detail, worked out that we did not need to put people through these extra costs to quite the same extent as we thought, and the reason for that is that Britain has been incredibly successful at driving towards net zero by 2050, and so we could ease off a bit and ensure that hard-working families don't have to pay that extra amount of money. He did the right thing on that, but actually, let's face it, the world is burning up, the oceans are dying, we are seeing the rise in temperature, the chemical changes. There were brush fires in London. And I listened
to Mark Harper saying we love the car.
There were brush fires in London.
We're the party of the motor car.
There were brush fires in London last year. Internationally and domestically, Britain is showing real leadership on net zero and climate change. Mark Harper, your colleague in Cabinet, the Transport Secretary, has stood up and said we are the party of the motor car. I am the Member of Parliament for the constituency with the most cars per head in the country. Of course we're on the side of the motorists, but the thing about this government since 2010 is that we have done the right thing on net zero, and we're now making sure that these dreadful Labour plans to penalise the motorist locally are not able to be rolled forward. There's no inconsistency there at all. But John, many of these dreadful plans are being put forward by Tory councils. Well, I was thinking, but I went to Uxbridge during the by-election there, and I saw the turmoil and misery being caused by these plans from the Mayor of London. And the Tory party has clearly heard the voice of people living in those circumstances, and we're going to make sure we put it right. Is it fair to say that your whole election strategy is being built around the Uxbridge by-election? No, not fair at all. Our election strategy is being built around doing the right thing for the economy, doing the right thing in this dreadful war that's going on in Ukraine, doing the right thing across all the different political pieces that our constituents are really concerned about, and delivering for them. Just one more question. You talk about Ukraine. How worried are you about what is happening in the US, where Congress has just signed a funding bill which strips out aid for Ukraine? No, I'm very worried about that, as is the President of the United States, whose statement I heard this morning. I think this is one of the aspects of domestic politics in the United States which we see playing out year after year, and I very much hope the end of this is that the budget is restored for support for Ukraine. This is a very important moment for the international system and for the world. If a country is able, particularly one of the permanent five at the United Nations, if a country is able to invade its neighbour, bomb its infrastructure, butcher its citizens in this way and get away with that, that will be a terrible moment for the international community. Are you frightened by the idea of a Donald Trump second term? Well, it's a matter for the Americans who they elect as their president, but were I a voter in America, I would not be voting for Donald Trump. Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And Lewis, you have been busy over the weekend, not just podcasting away, but also this really interesting investigation into the boats and people smuggling and the rest. Yeah, newsagents never sleeps, as you both know. And it couldn't be more apposite, because what's one of the big things emblazoned on this conference hall? One of the Prime Minister's 5 top priorities? Stop the boats. Stop the boats. And obviously all we ever hear from the Prime Minister and from Keir Starmer as well is we've got to crack down on people smugglers. That's the answer to all of it. Well, we have been speaking to a people smuggler. We have managed to identify one in a way that apparently the British and French police seem often incapable of doing, and we've caught up with him, had a conversation with him as part of an undercover investigation, and looking at the question as to how, if anything, what, if anything, the people smugglers can be stopped. And I have to say, from both in terms of what we've gathered there, but also reporting from there many times in the past, for me it is a red herring.
I mean, it is amazing, really, as a Conservative policy, that you could start by saying stop the boats, and by the end of this conference you could add stop the trains. Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.